Welcome everyone, Dr. Thor here. Get ready for Gnosis. Well, I want to cover a popular occultist in the area of German, Iranian, Arabic understandings. He's a author of what would be considered rune books. He was active in a lot of Odinist groups and other things, which I never personally had contact with Edred Flowers, otherwise known as Edred Thorsson. That's his pen name. But I did know a lot of people who had contact with him. Now, very early in my interest was, of course, Odinism, and which I felt was a very practical religion, which I came into contact with through a Soldier of Fortune magazine classified ads and followed through on that, and it certainly appealed to me because I saw life as that, as a basic struggle. It just makes a lot of sense, and found a kinship with the archetypes of the Norse religions. I never really was a person who believed in religion in general, and still don't to this day. But I do believe in archetypes. I believe there is a reality we need to look at of, well, you need strength or energy. We want to tap into this stream, as I call them, to connect to a particular God form or energy stream for what you're looking for. So if you want to heal someone, you connect to healing. If you want strength and power, you connect to another God form, etc. So, I always had great interest in the Norse gods, and they just seem to be a very practical understanding of these are the kind of energies you need in your life. And of course, when you get into alternative religions, they have many different energy streams or god forms, archetypes, to tap into. So it's not unusual. So I got involved in the different groups, which, I'll go into Odinism in another lecture because that needs to be talked about generally. But these were typical. And you got to remember, while this is kind of modern times, things are a lot different 30 years ago than they were today. I mean, there are virtually no information on the runes, on Viking religions, on anything else. There was a few books here and there published by a few people. I think there was the Odinism Handbook published from someone out of Minnesota who was a Norwegian. And these are all the things that were out there and were advertised in certain little publications that you could grab onto. And there was a certain forming of it. But these were tiny little groups done by kind of odd, different people, which is one of the major problems with paganism and alternative religions, is that the people involved with them are not what you would call average people, so they all kind of a little weird and have their own axes to grind. Now, the whole Odinist movement has a really dark side to it of being racist, Nazi, and this is, of course, true. People rejected Christianity because they rejected society, not necessarily embracing the culture and of the new belief system. It was more about, I'm against these people, which were, of course, most other groups, the Jews, the blacks, etc. Same old thing, and it wasn't about how great so-called white people were, which, of course, Germans are not, and Thorsson has come out and said this now. What is interesting how I'm always right. So the whole idea is that it became this, and there wasn't, like so many of these groups, they had a very low-level mentality. They didn't have any books written. It was really terrible. While a lot of other occult groups did, Wicca and so forth, had their scholars and other things, but certainly this group had nothing, and virtually nothing came out of them for years and years. And it really was about their race. I always said that Odinists, particularly most of them, and this has changed to some degree, were basically just a bunch of cowards that didn't want to become skinheads because that meant too much fighting and you had to be out in people's faces. And that pretty much is the truth. They knew nothing about the religion or the mythology. They were pamphlet readers. This is very typical of a lot of groups, and particularly groups that are based in these bizarre things. You found very little people that they considered, quote, white in these groups. They were basically a mixed group of people. There were occasional Iranian Germans, of course, the Arab group that people think are somehow white. But the whole idea is that there was a mixture of these types of things in there, and you wouldn't find hardly anybody Scandinavian. All the Scandinavians are Christians, and none of them seem to have any interest in this. And while they considered Vikings and all that stuff as part of their heritage and kind of fun, they never really took anything truly spiritual of any great degree. Their spirituality was based in Christianity when, of course, Northern Europe, the Norse, which is all of Scandinavia, of course, were converted by the sword by the Christians, of course, with their own people leading the charge. So all of this is something that people need to understand. So he was part of these groups because he is very much into left-handed path practices with a Germanic mysticism to it. And of course, today he calls himself Darbani Den, which is basically an Iranian Arabic name that he goes by now. He's transferred back to the original place that the Germans come from, which they're Arabs from Iran, and now has embraced Zoroastrianism. Well, isn't that interesting? And of course, that really fits, and it also fits why these people are so bogus in their belief systems. I was one of the first to expose him, and I found out that from a Satanist in San Francisco that he was up there teaching runes with the Church of Satan and was a member of the Church of Satan along with his good friend Michael Okino, who started the Temple of Set after the breakup of the Church of Satan. So I found out about that and I started telling the Odinist groups. I said, this guy is not really into this. He's a left-handed path. Now, most people were shocked by this. Very few people in the greater organization knew this. How many people knew it besides that was probably the fact that the Odinists were so ignorant and knew nothing of occultism. They were just rejecting Christianity and trying to embrace something different. So they weren't really interested in understanding what all this other stuff was. I frankly doubt few people knew what the left-hand path was, or even Satanism. So their ignorance, of course, allowed this to kind of go unchallenged. Some people knew it, but very few knew it ultimately. So when I exposed him, it was fairly new. So the whole idea is that from what people need to know where he's coming from and this charade he's pulling. But of course, you know, one of the problems is nobody has any proper information. And the bottom line is that this stuff about, quote, white people, which Germans are not white. Whites are Celts. The original whites were, of course, the Italians, the Greeks, the Welsh, and the Norse, which Germany is not Northern Europe, it's Central Europe, and the tribes that settled there came from Iran. People don't get that. I don't think even the Nazis never called themselves white people. They called themselves Aryans, because that's what the area of Iran that they came from is. So, this white power stuff came from the racists in America who grabbed onto this, not even knowing their history. How typical. These movements should have been more of a Celtic Nordic movement, not a German movement, who has perverted everything they've ever gone into and are one of the most psychotic evil societies ever created, who are now running Europe with their Muslim brothers and their communist rulers. Very, very interesting, and of course nobody seems to know this. So, but when you first started out, since there was virtually nothing on runes, there was Blum's book, which was kind of dissed by the Odinists as being this New Ager book, probably coming from a, quote, Jew, which I think Blum is. And this was kind of a New Age, and meant to be a New Age book. It was not meant to be a Odinist book. Now, Flowers apparently has been involved. Of course, he was born in Bonham, Texas, and he's a Texan, which ought to tell you some problems to begin with. He's 67, and apparently is a teacher at Austin Community College. Apparently, he originally, in September of 1971, went to Germany and spent a few months there studying at the Goethe Institute and traveling around Europe. And at that time, he connected with different groups. Of course, he was very young then. That's very interesting. He was I'm not even sure if he was legal. I'm trying to figure it out, but it really doesn't matter. The bottom line is he got involved with all of these black magic groups out there, particularly starting with the Mark de Sade Society, the Chateau Society, as it's called in general English, and apparently was hooked up with other German black magic groups. So he joined the Church of Satan in 1972 when it was a big popular group. He never really got overly involved in the organization, even though this is where he met Michael Aquino, who would go out to form the Temple of Set, the satanic military colonel that was involved in all sorts of alleged problems there, including it was alleged of child molestation, etc. So it's a lot of weird things going on, but very typical of what's going on. Apparently, Aquino had a good following of military officers, which ought to tell you a lot about that as well. He also instituted so many other things, but we'll cover him in another particular lecture. So he spent his time there. He got involved in all these groups. He was fluent in German and could read it, etc. So this allowed him to be able to easily do some research into the literature that was in German on the runes, where there is a very limited literature from certain people that were active pre-World War II and kept a little bit after that. Marby and a few others who were known for their different systems. He also was a member of the Armenin, of course, the Nazi Armenins, and learned their system, the von List system, and the Armenin group, which is still active within Germany out of Cologne. So he got involved with that and learned all that, even wrote a book on that, but the Armenin people weren't too happy about that, and he never published it. But he did read all the other literature and get involved in that, and took a lot of the very classical German books and translated them. Pretty well he translated them, even to the fact of that he copied the actual setup of the book, the German book. So it's very interesting. And of course, then he translated that into English, which then was translated back into German, and then the Germans bought the translated version of the German. Yeah, well, this is typical of the ignorant Germans as well. So he got involved in all that, and because of that, he picked it up. Now, runes coming from Germany is certainly a bogus way to get runes from people that know nothing about them. They're a foreign group of people picking up stuff that they felt like and adapting it, as they did with everything, claiming to be some sort of Nordics when they basically were Aryans or Iranians, Arabs, plain and simple. They're from Iran. And of course, if you look at the history of Iran right up to modern days, you can see the kind of sociopathic people they are and how they have taken on different religions. Of course, they are Muslim right now, and the radical Muslim sect that they are. But of course, what was the original religion in that area that goes back is Zoroastrianism. And you got people following that today, saying how old it doesn't matter whether it's old, is it any good? Now, the Zoroastrianism is interesting, and of course now he's converted over from this, mostly I think because he's been rejected by the, quote, Germanic community in America, who has pretty much had it with him. The Odinic Rite threw him out of England as well. These are all the things that happened once they found out what he was doing. So you've got to understand that he's left-hand path, which is generally thrown into the path of Satanism. Of course, he denies that, but of course he's going back to his, he denies the fact that he's Satanist because of the fact that connects to a Judeo-Christian belief system, which he violently rejects, even though he's from the Middle East and is an Arab, or at least claims that. Flowers is basically a British name of kind of mutt tradition, so we don't really know what his background is, or where he came from, or regardless of that, but I'm glad he's claiming to be German, being he's an Arab. So the bottom line is that it's amusing that he would reject. Now he's embracing it, which is amusing. But he would never embrace Satanism because that was part of the Judeo-Christian, which he was against, being a basically the type of magic he got involved in can be classified easily as Nazi runic magic. That's where he got his information from. That's who he connected with the Armenians. He went to worked with Germans, again, who were all connected to this Nazi stream of information. The runes have always been connected to the Nazis in Germany in particular, so people that embrace the runes tend to be the Nazi people. Other ones are not overly interested in them. Of course, this has changed in recent years, but when you're talking about other times when this was a very odd area to get into, and something that I was researching, well, where did you go get information from? Well, there weren't hardly any books written about runes, period. Blum's books were everybody bought, but they were very cursory. They were meant for New Agers. Soon after that, Edred Flowers came out with his book, which basically was a person who was serious. But what was very interesting in his original book published by Samuel Weiser, the Jewish publishing company, and whose daughter he married, who was Jewish. Huh? It's always like that with these people. It's always like it with the Jews and these people as well, is that they seem to get involved with it. The Church of Satan, which was taken over by his daughter and a guy named Shrek, whatever his name is. He's Jewish as well, and he loves the Nazi magic. They really should have taken this camp where they raped people endlessly. They used their German Shepherd dogs to rip babies out of mothers' arms. That's a nice little thing to go to, huh? Murdered millions of them, shrunk their heads, cut their tattoos off, and in general butchered them by the millions. But it's okay. Well, we all have to understand that that's very Arabic. So, and everyone should know that. So this whole idea of it's really not even hiding behind it. There's just a huge misconception that Germans are white or somewhere in the Celtic Nordic tribe. Wrong. And that they somehow are held up by racists as being great when they're not. And the whole misunderstanding of Germany and everything else I will clarify in many, many lectures to come. So it's very important to understand that. You're never going to change your life or the world if you're living in urban legend and delusion. We need to seek truth, and that's why I make all these things. We have to know what the truth is, and I have been appointed to do that. I constantly run into these things. I'm constantly pushed in areas. Now, should I learn this from personally? Well, it has to be talked about. And whoever listens to this and gets it, well, you're one of the few that are reaching and will achieve gnosis. If you live in a delusion, if you live in urban legend, you'll get nowhere and you'll be controlled by people who are not good people, plain and simple. And there are many, many of them. Really sad. So the whole idea is this guy has this murky background. I exposed him with the Odinist. Most people, as I said, didn't know about it. A few people did. And, of course, he started a whole bunch of organizations. And, of course, the Odinists, as I said, are very low-level, ignorant people that didn't know nothing. As I said, I'm not sure they even understood what anything was. It was basically started, well, we're against Christianity because we don't like what they're doing. He started different groups. As I said, the Odinist Rite in England threw him out that he was a member of. I was a member of that organization as well for a while. That was pretty much the big English-speaking Odinist group was the Odinist Rite. I'm not sure. They're probably still going. I'm not entirely sure. This was something that everybody contacted. And of course, he was a member of everything he could get his hands on to infiltrate and sell his products. And I don't want to get into too many details here. If you want to do details, look things up, get the more detailed information. Even Seweropedia is relatively correct in what they state about him. So if you want the details of the organizations and people involved and the different people, and there's a lot of people that are these Satanists that are calling themselves Odinists that are part of the problem that we all need to look at and understand who you're dealing with. The bottom line is that if people are going to call themselves Odinists or Norse religion, who are basically based in the left-handed path, based in Arabic magic, well, this is something you should be informed about. Do you want to be involved with these people? What is actually going on? And this is critical to understand. So they're misleading you. That's not what they're into, and they're embracing people who have completely alien belief systems. They are misleading you, lying you for their own particular purposes. This warped understanding of the runes and everything else that he puts together, the demonizing of the Norse gods, is absurd and obscene. It's insulting that they hide behind it. Now, as I said, his first book, which was published by showing his great power by his wife's father, the Jew. I still can't get over that. But, he made sure that he had no problem worming his way into getting his book published somehow. Stated in there in his introduction, which I found interesting. I read it, but I didn't know who Michael Aquino was. But he puts in there, and this is what I mean by they're not hiding it entirely. So, and this is a game people play. They don't come out and say it, but they have enough references if you're in tune. But he thanked Michael Aquino, the founder of the Temple of Set, for his help in this, and that he was part of the Temple of Set's German magic, I should say Nazi magic division of the Temple of Set, which he ran. And from all my understandings, which I'm not sure what the reality of that is, of course it was set up with these pseudo-intellectual types at the top. And of course, Edred Thorsson, Edred Flowers, was, from what I understand, kind of second in command of the Temple of Set. Which of course makes sense, Set being an Egyptian god, so he was connected to a Middle Eastern Arabic type, because the Egyptians are Mediterranean Arabs, basically, group. So here we go again, that they're connected to the same armpit of reality that comes from the Middle East, claiming that they are some sort of different Nordic group. But again, the Germans are not Nordics, they are Arabs. So it's important to understand that they are not Northern Europeans, they're Central Europeans, and people need to understand that. But, I don't want to confuse anybody with the facts. So this is very typical here. This whole German question needs to be something that I will cover in another long lecture. And this is just a fact that people are misled, and you need to know what's going on. So if you want to go into the details of all this, but he got his first book, as I said, was there, and that's in his book, and I believe it's still in his book, that he thanks Michael Aquino, the famous Satanist, who broke away from the Temple of Set when they needed help to start his own organization, because he didn't like Anton LaVey, because Anton LaVey was a little bit too much showy, and I think it took away from his military officer view that he was subservient to this guy. So he wanted to start his own made-up organization, and of course that's what the Temple of Set is. It's a made-up organization. Michael Aquino readily states it, because there was nothing to actually build it on. So this is very important to understand as the bigger picture. I came to find this out, as I said, from someone else, and then I connected with things about Michael Aquino that were broadcast from a late-night radio show by a guy named, what was his, Tuckman or something, but he was on the radio, and I think still is in Los Angeles, for many, many years, giving you all this wild conspiracy information. And a part of it was things like, before it was even popular, Terence McKenna. He talked about the problems with the Nazis, and of course, Michael Aquino and those people that were harassing other people. A lot of people have claimed they've been harassed by Michael Aquino, and there was a book written on that. All this information I started to come to me, and I put all the pieces together there. And of course, then it started to come that he was part of this satanic group, these left-hand path people, and you can't get any more to the point than thanking the head of the Temple of Set in your book. So, he never was he's always a left-hand path person claiming that these were more from the basic Arabic Zoroastrianism, which he now calls himself. So he's changed his whole tune to go back to that. I guess he's written so much on the boring German stuff through his interpretation that now he can make more money from that. So very typical that these kind of people and groups tend to flourish in Texas, the Illuminati capital. And of course, he's hiding out in Texas in the one area of craziness called Austin, which has a wild group of people there. And apparently teaching there as his main interest in a community college. But I got his information when he was new and even had a minor amount of contact. And the bottom line is that his stuff was very poorly done. For a guy who was a college professor, he had horribly typed little pamphlets you could barely read. Everything that he's written, particularly his little pamphlets, he came out talking about how to use S&M sexuality in magic, written like it was a grade school comic book. They never really say anything. I don't think they know very much because none of their books really have anything interesting or profound in them. But he got into all that. He runs his own little S&M group. Of course, doesn't that fit as part of his groups? He's got all these little offshoots and all the people he's dealt with, and this is all part of what they're doing. And he started his own publishing. Nobody wanted to publish his books after a while, apparently. He apparently was very good friends with Llewellyn Nowetzki, the publisher of Llewellyn Books. He claims on an interview that's on YouTube that he and Carl were fantastic friends, and that he worked for him and paid him and everything else. Isn't that another interesting little satanic connection? And you can just go through the entire publishing industry, as we have today with Bear Books, who's publishing Edred Flowers, the Nazi Satanists. The Jewish Israeli publisher is publishing his books. Isn't that interesting? So here we go again with the infected, controlled media and publishers. So he's published all this stuff, and it was all pretty mediocre. He published some of his more detailed books and everything else, and it's a lot of pseudo-intellectual rubbish. And the actual heart of everything is basically, as with most very bad researchers and thinkers, is that they went back to other books that were written wrong and thought they were right and then republished it. But very little came from him, particularly when it gets into practical runic ideas. Very little of this came from him personally. He pretty much copied everything, from what I can tell, of all of these German books and borrowed everything from the Armenians to Marby to all the other things that he has written books on. They are almost exact copies of the books. He's translated some of these books, and they are exact copies, including the Armenian von List book as well, with his bizarre understandings. So all of this certainly doesn't show a great mind. He's involved in all these other things. He's obviously had mediocre success being a professor at a community college. He's not a professor at the college. It's the community college of Austin is where he's teaching, apparently, philosophy and whatever else he does. And that's been his main. He still lives in Texas. He is married now to another woman who is helping him run this S&M club. And of course, the problem is when you get people who are left-hand path Satanists, not seeking truth, but seeking to change horses, regardless of whether it's smart to do that, and condemn the corrupt horse they were on, instead of, hey, let's get off this horse and feed it properly, get it back into shape, instead of saying, well, we're just going to shoot the horse in the head and leave it on the ground. And of course, that's what all these people that reject certain mainstream religions do, to, instead of saying, well, look, I mean, there's some good things here. The problem is it's corrupt. So what they do is start their own corrupt religion as similar as that. So he's come out more and more, and of course now recently even changing his name to reflect his Iranian actual background. And of course, as I said, that's people just don't get that. Well, you should. One thing, of course, that these groups tend to do and always have is the fact that they're so desperate for members that they go into prisons and get these people. This is a typical tactic of the Odinists to try and find these white supremacist types that are in prison and teach them. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just that they don't really have a following, and nobody really follows them. There's really no Scandinavians or Nordics in any of the Odinist groups that I found to any great degree. There's a scattering of the Nazis that join there, but ultimately they want to, on their own little Hitler agenda. Most of the people involved there are people from different Celtic and other backgrounds of all sorts of types. So there really wasn't any great following, nor is there a lot of these people in general, even though there's a lot of literature now. And there are certain groups around the world, but the numbers of them are very tiny. As with all these kind of groups when you really get involved with it. And there's no support groups, there's nobody really assisting each other, and it's a very, very typical of particularly these types of groups connected, these pagan groups, is that they do virtually nothing to help each other, and they're very scattered, strange, disconnected people in society. So there isn't much money there. They're odd people making small amounts of money, and they tend to be very greedy and very backstabbing. So in general, he got involved with every single black magic so-called German fraternity, including the Fraternity of Saturn. All of these groups he got connected with. He got connected with all the S&M groups. I mean, this is where this guy is coming from. But all of this stuff was not really very marketable. So what was he going to write on, and had difficulties doing it, getting published, was on the runes. So why Carl, his buddy, never published him, I have no idea. I think he was very afraid of being labeled a Satanist, even though Llewellyn's, of course, order line ends with 666. And, of course, it seems apparent what they are into, and I allege that they are heavily involved, and they are real problems. Llewellyn Publishing, and quite interesting. Of course, refuse any contact with me. And I'll tell you where they're coming from. So the whole idea is that we get into all these things with the muck and mire of this kind of thing, of how they get into places. And there's a bigger picture here of how all these people are supported, and the alleged criminal contacts that all of these Satanists have. So it's an interesting look at everything, and if you're going to get information from this guy, you're going to have a real serious problem here. This is a guy who is definitely into Nazi magic, which people have to understand. This is not some movie land joke. The Nazis were horrific butchers and have come out of this now with their smiley faces and got away with the fact of having taken over a lot of the United States, with tens of thousands of them are brought in, where they infiltrated the military and science, and of course destroyed our rocket program that Werner von Braun was appointed, where 15,000 people were murdered by him. So this is not a joke, and people somehow, because they feel alienated by Christian societies and by the split in America, which is all these different people, even if they are, quote, European, but they're very diverse Europeans. You know, everybody's a little bit different. The Brits are different than the Germans are different than the Italians, the Spanish, etc. So nobody really feels at home in America. So people try and glum onto these kind of false understanding of this barbaric Arab culture that is sweeping the world now, led by, in this modern time, again, by this whole German thought pattern, which basically is not German, it's called Deutschland, so which is an Arabic word. So the whole idea is that all of these things need to be fully understood of what's going on here, and this guy has been part of it. He's misled a lot of people by hiding behind runes and other things where he could make his money from, and found a core interest in America, people kind of seeking their heritage, trying to get away from the Judeo-Christian alienated society as they saw it. And of course, that's why people moved into these paganism in general. And it doesn't necessarily have to be the Odinism. There's Druid groups, the Wicca groups. So these are all people who are seeking different paths because they are alienated by what's considered the mainstream. And of course, rightly so. But you generally don't do this unless you're kind of an odd person. It's rare that you're going to find someone who is actually quote, normal, and normal people didn't stay in these groups, as I didn't, because there's too many odd people. They're on bizarre trips. They've got bizarre opinions. It becomes not a nationalistic or a Odinist group of people. It becomes a hate society. It wasn't the fact of how great these gods are and what they teach us. It was how terrible everybody else's gods and how they were all horrible and so forth. They missed the point, but this is the urban legend that everybody lives in, which is frightening and scary. And people need to understand the truth, and you need to get out of these urban legends you're living in. Get the facts. So I found this out, and through many different things by being connected. Most people didn't. And most people, even to this day, as his books are distributed around the world, are reading his books, which have no validity whatsoever. They are copied from really bad text produced by a lot of ignorant occultists that are very typical of the Germans. They knew nothing, and nobody contacted them. Certainly the Nordics, who seem to have nothing on runes that is public, certainly weren't working with the German raping invaders who took over all of Scandinavia. They didn't work with the Germans. They were attacked by the Germans. So were the Dutch and everyone else. Well, of course, the Germans attacked every single, quote, Nordic society they could, and then tried to claim they were Nordics and stole all their babies when they found out that they were actually Arabs. So, it's very, very interesting. And of course, having personal knowledge of this by being involved in this whole particular area. And even based in family-wise, as the fact that my father thought he was a German because his father was born in Bavaria, Germany, from two 100% Italian parents. So they emigrated to Germany from Venice. And they were both 100% Italian, Northern Italian, and he has absolutely no German blood in him whatever. And when you're born in a country, doesn't make you part of that country. You're basically where you come from racially. That becomes a cultural aspect. So while there are cultural aspects there, so it has absolutely nothing to do with your actual racial background. And of course, my father's mother was Irish. So he was half Italian, half Irish. So that's really the bottom line of it. So when you understand all this, so this was this glorified that he somehow thought he was a German when he wasn't at all, and this was something that was followed within the family and thought of to stupid level. Of course, he was a very stupid man and knew nothing. So this is what happens with everybody where they don't get the facts of it all. But you need to get the facts of it all. There's a dangerous situation going on in Europe and has been going on for hundreds of years. And there's now a new giant alliance, the Russian-German-Turkish Federation, which is taking over the world with their basically Islamic belief systems, their Arabic backgrounds, to try and take over. And they've done this with the EU, and what Hitler couldn't do with banks, he did with tanks. And, couldn't do with tanks, he did with banks, I should say. I put that backwards there. But the bottom line is that's what's happening, because it is this federation who took over when the wall fell, which is running all of Europe. And that means they run the banks, because there's nothing in the EU of any kind of unity, and I will talk about that in other lectures as well. So this guy who's put out a lot of books on runes, and of course, if you're a real rune scholar, you need to read these books. Hopefully you don't buy them, but you get them somewhere. there is some interesting information there. Now, I haven't found things overly polluted by him, but there are lots of subtleties and interpretations that a master runist like myself can see where he's twisted it. He also has a twisted view of the Viking gods, so to speak, or the Norse gods, making them evil to fit in his left-handed path reality, similar to all the things the Nazis did in general. So, but the Nazis weren't anyway into Norse religions. They were into their own perverse kind of left-handed path Christianity. They were this is another misunderstood. And of course, they stole the runes, but they thought the runes they were stealing the runes basically from their Iranian ancestors, particularly of northern India, where they came from as part of this migration to where they went to from Iran. These were basically symbols taken from there. The runic practitioners in Germany were all jailed and murdered. So there wasn't anybody there except for a bunch of lunatical people that were there. As usual with the Nazis, lunatics, homosexuals, drug addicts, and nut jobs. I mean, how can you say Goering, the head of the Luftwaffe, used to wear powder blue uniforms and wear makeup? This is your Nazi. Oh, it's so good. You're such manly. Bend over, honey. So the whole idea is that this is your very typical Germanic. Which isn't even correct. These are Deutschlanders. Germania was a Roman general who conquered a huge part of Europe, which was named Germania, and the actual Germans of today don't call themselves Germans. They call themselves Deutschlanders, with their big noses, big ears, and brown eyes and brown hair, reflecting their cultural background. So we have all those things that is very typical that people just don't understand. So the fact is, all of this has been taken by this guy to pervert it. So if you read his books, be very careful. And if you're aware, you can read information. And then when there's something of question or doesn't seem to ring true with you, well, you know why. And that's what being informed is all about. So who is this guy? So this guy is a Nazi. Now he's an Iranian Zakoister magician. He's left-hand path. He's involved in sadomasochistic sex, which he writes a book on. And it just goes on and on and on. He's a Nazi magic practitioner. He's heavily involved with the Temple of Set. And it goes on and everything that goes with that. So, I mean, this is it. And finally, the real background has come out. He calls himself now an Iranian Zakoister priest. This is what he considers his roots, because maybe he's been told that finally. But of course, there's very little money in that. He's certainly not going to get a whole bunch of American pseudo-white people to jump behind an Iranian religion. You're not going to find that. So he couldn't make any money there and won't make any money. He's already 67. I don't know what books he's going to come out with, and he has a fairly good stream of income, I'm assuming, from his books that are translated and sold all over the world. So, but he's going to find out that those kind of books certainly aren't going to sell very well. So stay informed. If there's going to be changes, if you are going to ascend to a higher level, you need to stop believing in and thinking that urban legend is fact. You're living in a fantasy world. Get the facts. And it always comes down to trust no one, believe nothing, come to your own conclusions, get educated, get to a point where you can objectively look at something, and then, of course, seek other knowledge. Never believe anything. Verify it for yourself. And that includes what I say. I have third-party verification of everything that I talk about. This is not secret. It's out there. You can find it easily. It is not in any way kept from you. It's just that nobody reads this stuff. Nobody looks behind the curtain of any reality. And it's as simple as that. But you're setting yourself up for failure, and you will not reach a state of gnosis if you continue to live in urban legend, created information to control and move you in a particular direction, which is completely false. It's a control medium. Now, you need to go past that. And this means the fact if you're going to reach high levels of empowerment, if you're going to empower yourself past the levels that society is trying to control you, you have to be living in gnosis and in truth. If you live in their truth that they control, you can be guaranteed that this will disempower you. Until next time.